Hello everyone and welcome to our second instructional webinar at Seds Online. We're really pleased to be able to offer these alongside our classic series, classic being 2 months, but the normal ones of the scientific instruction, and we'll be having another one of those next week. But for now, we've got a fantastic talk that we've got and Gary's going to be presenting it on a self-confessed guide, beginner's guide to running a virtual field course. Now we're really pleased to be able to offer these webinars and all of our resources for free, thanks to sponsorship from the International Association of Sedimentologists, the IAS. And so without further ado, I'm going to introduce Gary, our speaker, and then we can hear what he's got to say. So Gary started lecturing at Imperial College London in 2000, and since then he's been organising, leading and developing traditional field courses over his career. But in light of COVID-19, things need to change fast, and Gary and Lydia worked hard to move one of their field courses online at short notice, and they had great success. So as many of us are going to be facing similar challenges in the near future, Gary and Lydia have kindly agreed to share with us the tricks of the trade so that we can make the best of this situation. So I'll hand over now to you, Gary. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Catherine, and hello, everyone. I should say here that not only am I a self-confessed beginner in terms of running a virtual field trip, but I'm also, not the most technologically equipped either. So I did think about calling this an idiot's guide to running a virtual field trip. I'll let you decide on that one. I should also say that what I'm going to present here, a lot of it was, maybe the bulk of the credit really belongs to Lydia, who put a lot of the work into the original traditional field trip. So I've got maybe kind of half an hour, 40 minutes worth of things to talk through. And what I'm going to show you here, let me begin by talking a bit about the student group and when we did this and who was involved in running the trip. So maybe the first thing here is, we had to run this trip at very short notice. We were set up to go on to fly out to Spain, run the field trip on the ground, and we had to basically abandon that plan and then switch to doing something online and remote in the space of 2.5 weeks. Yeah, so just to maybe explain a bit about the background to the student group, we had 35 students. They're master's level students. So what that means is they already have, strong basic field skills, And what we're doing on this field trip is to teach them how to apply those skills to specific problems. So that had quite a big impact on the style of teaching we would do normally in the field and what we were aiming to do on the virtual field trip. In terms of sort of the timing of the trip, again, if we'd been running this in Spain, we would have had eight full working days in Spain with a half-day of travel either side, and that ended up being condensed a little bit to avoid the weekend. So we had 7 working days of the remote field trip. And we had 2 staff, Lydia, who's a structural geologist, and me as a sedimentologist. And we had 4 GTAs. So those are basically PhD students who were demonstrating on the trip. And 3 of them have been on the trip previously, actually, on site, on location. And they're all, kind of very knowledgeable and also, very hardworking. And we really couldn't have run the trip without the 4 of them. So big thanks to them. The other kind of maybe key thing here is that this is a field trip we'd run quite extensively before. So Lydia had run this field trip before in different forms 8 times, sometimes in slightly different groups, and I'd run it 3 times. So what that meant is we had a pretty good idea about, what the geological context of the area was, what the geology offers us in terms of being able to teach. We weren't running it from scratch again, which would have been a really quite different experience. So before I to thank lots of people. So again, the field trip, either in Spain and a virtual version, we could rely on an awful lot of really good published material to put together. We had great geological maps from particularly from the Catalonia Geological Survey, and those are digital and they can be downloaded from the website for the Geological Survey of Catalonia. We also used some virtual outcrop models. So John Howell in Aberdeen, Simon Buckley in Bergen, and their various colleagues. And I know that John gave a webinar about these virtual outcrops maybe 3 weeks ago. But they're a very valuable resource. Lewis Ardeval, providing some material. Kevin Pickering as well. We used core photographs for some of the exercises that Kevin had, again from a couple of locations on the field trip. Alan Martinez, who's at Equinor and TU Delft. Richard Jolly at BP, and Mike Mail, who was at BP and now has an honorary position at Imperial. And IT support in the department, but also our families as well, because I think in many ways we might have been working at home running this field trip, but actually in many respects we might as well have not been at home. It was pretty full on for the 7 days of the field trip. So maybe let me give you a bit of context for this field trip. So the slide, which hopefully should be appearing on your screens now, shows kind of the 12 months of this master's program. The left-hand side is basically term 1, that's the 1st of October essentially, and then the course runs for 12 months towards the right through to the end of September. And terms 1 and 2 in there are sort of typical, traditional classroom-based lectures typically. There's some big group projects and so on, and some short field trips in there. And of course, this year we were able to deliver all of that as we normally would. And then, the issue about having to teach remotely struck us basically right around Easter time. So the Pyrenees field trip was really the first big piece of teaching that we delivered remotely. And that takes place after classroom teaching. So again, it's a sort of synthesis trip where we've given the students lots of theory. Some of that theory are things they should be familiar with to some degree, and some of that theory is new. And the purpose of the field trip is to try to synthesize and to reinforce things in the classroom. Okay, so the next slide shows that the students who did go in 2019. So there we are, a class of almost 50 students in the beautiful Spanish sun. That's what we would have liked to have done, but of course we didn't do that. So the next slide really sort of reinforces some of what I've already said. In terms of the aims here, they're quite high level. So it's to unravel, structural and sedimentological history of basins that clearly demonstrate the link between structure and its impact on sedimentation, to consolidate classroom learning. The second set of bullet points at the bottom of the slide there, this is a petroleum focused masters, so often what we're doing when we go in the field is we're pulling out lessons that you might be able to apply to data sets from the subsurface, typically far less data, but you take concepts in the field and you apply them to subsurface data. I'll come back to this, but what was very important for us is we weren't trying to teach basic fieldwork skills. We can assume that everyone on the field course knows how to make a sedimentary log. They know how to interpret sedimentary structures, although sometimes they did a bit of prodding. They know how to take strike and dip, for example, and to interpret Rose diagrams. I think this would be quite different if you were trying to teach, say, a first or second year undergraduate level class, where it's those skills you're trying to get across rather than the application of them. So the next slide shows what we used. So we have a field guide that's pretty extensive. It's supposed to be kind of all inclusive, so students don't need to go and look at textbooks, for example, or lecture notes. So we had a hard copy of that, and we also had a digital copy. Exercises. So most days, not every day, but most days, there's an exercise that links to the different outcrops we visit and is on a particular theme. We also had folders of literature, so papers. We used digital photo panoramas and core photos. So the ones we use were probably quite low tech, really just photo pans on the scale typically of 10 megabytes in terms of size, but you can obviously zoom in and out on those. Things like gigapans would be a much more useful, a better version of that tool, but more computationally expensive as well. We distributed slide packs, so typically the introduction to a day and maybe 2 or 3 slides to introduce a particular location. We use Google Earth quite a lot, and as I'll hopefully show you, that's a very useful tool, particularly in this area where the landscape at the surface topography is a really strong reflection of the geology. So you can look at a topographic map, for example, and you know where the major structures are. And that meant that Google Earth was very useful as a tool to get into the landscape in that sense. And Lidia also draped geological maps on top of the Google Earth images. So that again reinforced the link between the landscape and the underlying geology. We also used the virtual outcrop models. And again, there were a couple of locations we went to where we used John Howell's and Simon Buckley's and their groups virtual outcrop models, and they were really useful. In terms of software and equipment, well, the Imperial College preference and what we're supported to use is Microsoft Teams, but that's has very similar functionality to Zoom, for example. PowerPoint, an application called Lens. That was what we used for assessments, or in other words, for students to kind of send us material, basically take photographs of material for us to assess and compile this into PDFs. Obviously, an internet browser, access to Acrobat, Google Earth, a smartphone with a camera. We assume that all the students have those. So those are kind of the minimum requirements. One issue is also that different students have got different workspaces at home, different access to laptops, to desktop PCs, and so on. So that's something that affected us the way we ran the field trip, and will probably also be true for you as well. We also use software called Panopto. It's basically a video recording software. There's a functionality in Microsoft Teams, as there is in Zoom, to do that, but Panopto was the one that we were used to from lecture theatres, so we kind of stuck to that because it was what we knew, really, and a way of storing things online. But because we're able to send out hard copies of the field guide and hard copies of exercises for the field, we also got the students to do quite a bit of work, sketching things themselves on an A4 pad, so looking at photos and making sketches, for example, or working through exercises. And some students who had the right tablets, for example, or to hand, they were able to work digitally. Other students worked by sketching on hand on pieces of paper, and it was probably a 50-50 split within the group. And actually, from our point of view, getting students to share their work and the quality of that work, there was no real obvious difference between those two groups of students, although that's not always how the students themselves might have perceived things. Okay, so there's a kind of a list of resources there, and maybe one thing to emphasize here is that actually putting those together took a fair amount of time, above and beyond what we would normally have done if we'd run this field trip in Spain. So that's basically the 2.5 weeks beforehand was all spent putting this together, essentially. So what do they look like? Well, this next slide here is showing it's a still image of a Google Earth map with a geological map draped over the top. This is a map, an oblique view looking at the Hampson Basin, with the top of the screen is towards the north, and you can see there's a broad syncline picked out by the bedding there around the lake in the foreground. So again, really just to make the point that this is probably a little bit site specific, but if the landscape really does link closely to the geology, then Google Earth and draped geological maps would be a really strong recommendation. That does require that students have access to that software and right computers to be able to manipulate those data, and that is a potential issue. But if you can make this work, then it was very effective in making that link. And I would say this is probably one of the take homes for me. from running this field trip in a traditional way. I think this is something we'll do in future years, maybe as in preparation for the field trip, or to prepare the students for field trips actually in Spain, is spend a bit of time running through this material before we actually go in the field, because it does really put individual localities in context, and it links the landscape to the geology really clearly. The other thing that other things that we did, well, we've got 35 students in the group, and that's quite a big group. You know, that would feel quite big in the field, and often in those sort of big groups, you know, some of the students are quite reluctant to speak up and to contribute, and it's also quite difficult to really keep on track of how much people are taking in, and you know, particularly doing that remotely, you lose that kind of direct face-to-face contact as well, where you can get a sense about whether someone is understanding what you're teaching. So the way we tried to sort of get around that was to split the students up into smaller groups. So we set up groups of 8 or 9 students. Each of them had a GTA, or, you know, PhD student demonstrator. And, you know, once we'd done the introduction to particular outcrops at particular locations, the students split into these smaller groups, and they work together through a particular task and an outcrop, guided by the GTA. And Lydia and I sort of floated between these 4 groups, so we could just drop in and out and contribute as and when needed. And I'd say actually in terms of the style of teaching, that was very, very effective. So again, that's a really strong recommendation. Is, if you know, get good PhD demonstrator support, get things organized so those demonstrators are able to lead small groups, and then use that as the vehicle for the students to work together and get a sense of how well they're able to understand what you're trying to teach to them. Okay, so this next slide shows a map of where we go to. The details here aren't too important. You know, if we were in Spain, we'd have started in the east and moved progressively further west, and that's just simply for logistical reasons. We have to do things in a certain order governed by the geographical locations. So again, you know, one sort of piece where you have a bit more flexibility by doing things remotely is that you can actually, you're not constrained by geography to do things in a particular order. So we did group together some outcrops which would have seen on different days if we'd been geographically in Spain, but thematically there's a stronger link to put them together, and we're able to do that in the remote field trip. So, you know, the kind of the typical daily plan. Well, we try to you know, the typical sort of classroom hours at Imperial are 9 till 12, then a 2-hour break, and then 2 till 5. So it's a 6-hour day with a big break in the middle. Obviously on the field trip, you know, the days are a bit longer. There's more traveling between stops, for example, and we found that we needed basically to work more to the typical field days. So we tended to start at 8:30. We aimed to finish by 5 p.m, although probably, you know, half the time we were finishing closer to 6 and to 5. We had 1 hour for lunch break in the middle, but we also had lots of kind of short breaks interspersed all the way through. So we tried not to go for more than an hour without giving people a chance to have a loo break or make a cup of tea or coffee. So in other words, you know, kind of splitting the day into smaller segments than we typically would have done, but that did mean we went probably a little bit longer than we would have originally intended to. Now, typically, they say the first half hour of the day would just be a briefing. This is what we're going to do on this particular day, and these are the stops we'll visit, and this is what we want to get from those stops to address the overall aim of the day. We typically visit 3 to 5 localities each day, so again, pretty typical to what we would have done, you know, physically in Spain. And each one of those field localities, as well as exercises that might span a whole day, each locality, you want the students to be doing something. So that could be sketching, that could be, you know, sketching a panorama, it could be making observations and filling in a sedimentary log, for example, and I'll show you examples of those. And so typically this is what the students were doing in their smaller groups. They might work together for 20 minutes to 50 minutes, depending on the specifics of the task. Then we'd gather everyone together, all the small groups together. So we had the full 35 students in the class. And, we'd have prepared groups to, group A and group B, you're going to present to us what you found from this locality. And then the students would basically, typically 2 or 3 students in each group would have work prepared that they were happy to share. And again, that was very effective. I mean, that we were probably able to get the students to showcase as much of their work to us virtually as we would do typically in the field itself. So, and again, a lot of that was down to the fact that the GTAs, the demonstrators, were very interactive and very good at sort of pushing people sometimes a little bit out of their comfort zones, but making sure the more dominant characters in the group didn't just hijack proceedings. The last sort of set of bullet points there, I mean, so most days we work through an exercise that, we build up over those 3 to 5 field locations. That could be making a paleographic map or a correlation panel, for example. So I've got some examples here of tasks that we say individual localities that we ask students to do. So here you're looking at an image, a photo panorama. So this is what we gave the students. This would have been a PDF in the order of 10 megabytes in size, and the students have the ability to zoom in and out a little bit. We asked them to sketch the structure in here, and then also to draw reconstructions of how that structure developed through time. So what you can see on here, you can see on here, the beds at the top of the picture are gently folded, but close to horizontal. Towards the left there, the beds are dipping more steeply and progressively dipping more gently towards the left there. So these are looking at here is growth strata, and there's even been some overturning of the strata on the left of the photo. And the bottom right there is one student's reconstruction of that based on their sketch. So this is, we do a pretty similar thing in the field if we'd actually been physically in Spain. I think one advantage we didn't really foresee of using photo panoramas is the ability to zoom in and out, and that's probably even those students with binoculars would probably struggle often to get to see the level of detail you could on a good sort of photo pan to zoom in and out. So a similar kind of thing in here, that another example of a photo panorama. This case we zoomed all the way out, and you can see what looked to be a fairly simple set of gently dipping strata, interbedded sandstones and marls. But we can zoom in on the next slide to this area up on the top left of this photo montage, and you can see in there that there's actually some dipping surfaces within the sandstones. So effectively these are deltaic cliniforms, delta front cliniforms, and what you can then interpret, well, okay, each of those thicker sandstone units is one delta lobe deposit. And again, I think typically if you'd been physically in Spain, this is quite hard often to get the students at this locality to make the right observations at the right scale, but actually with the photo montages that becomes a little bit easier. So some of that kind of long distance views, it is more straightforward, although often quite guided compared to what we would have actually in the field itself. Here's another example of much closer, much smaller scale. So here, looking at a photo montage of a single crossbed, which is about 1/2 meter in thickness, and the student here, in this case, they annotated on on a tablet. They annotated some of the main foreset surfaces, which are lined by mud crepes in this example. So this, what we were asking the students to do here is make observations of the geometry of the crossbeds, and you can see that some of them have a sigmoidal geometry. Sort of, you actually see the crest of, or the preserved crest of the dune. some had mud drapes, and there's a packaging to the mud drapes. So we want the students to make observations which would push them towards interpreting potential action of tides in this example. I should also say for this slide of the crossbed, some students annotated on tablets, others just drew sketches, and they were equally as effective in terms of making the right observations. Again, quite guided by us, but making observations to support that interpretation. So we also used the virtual outcrop model. I mentioned these already, that John Howell's and Simon Booker's groups in Bergen and Aberdeen. This is something they've been working on for 15 years or more, and they've got a library of virtual outcrops, including 2 of the counties that we visited. So these are a great resource. I mean, they're really fantastic. Students can go in and they can look at the outcrops in 3D. They can rotate and view them from different angles. That's a plus side of these. The negative side is that's all quite computationally intensive. So, for us, the challenge was to make sure that half the class who could basically had the computer resources in the work environment to be able to do that, how were they able to work with those students who basically couldn't access those virtual outcrop models directly? So the way that we did that was, we took some PDF views, some still images of the virtual outcrops, and we sent those out to all of the students so that they all had something to work with. But the other thing that we found once the students were working in their smaller groups of 8 or 9 is that actually those students who did have the right sort of hardware and software, they were very happy to kind of share results. They made little movies, they shared with their colleagues who couldn't or didn't have those resources to hand. So again, that was another advantage of a small group teaching, was those material being disseminated in a way that we hadn't really, to be honest, foreseen at the beginning of the field trip. In terms of sedimentary logs, quite a few locations we visited, we would typically spend 1 to 2 hours if we were geographically in Spain. We give the students a log that shows grain size, but just grain size, and that's really as a template. And they fill in the sedimentary structures with their own observations. Now, obviously, because we were doing this remotely, we couldn't let the students go and look at the outcrop, but we did. We were fortunate because we'd been there before in having quite a good library of photographs of key views of the outcrop, sedimentary structures. So in this case, we can pick out and sketch out the main bed boundaries between crossbed sets, for example. The students can locate themselves in a log and sort of fill in the spaces. Another example of in this case, compound bars or compound bed forms, dune scale cross beds superimposed on larger bar scale cross stratification. But the key thing is, we for each of these sort of log templates, we might have between 5 and 10 photographs. Again, we give the students sort of 30 minutes to 50 minutes to work in their groups, make observations, and add detail to the log sections. Again, that seemed to work pretty effectively. Obviously, the downside there is that we're feeding the observations to the students. What they're not doing is going out and developing their own critical ability to select which views to observe. And that, that again is kind of one downside that would probably be more magnified if you're talking about taking a field trip for, say, a first or second year undergraduate group who don't have those basic field skills at the same level. This is an example of one of the exercises we'd worked through. So this is a correlation through, four locations, and again, we were able to set the students up in a way that they were able to work through this exercise. We give them an hour at the end of the day to work through this, to the point they have an answer that they can start to discuss and share with the group, and then obviously we also discuss that and wrap up as a group as a whole. and some examples of the students' work. So here's an example, one student of drawing on paper a paleographic map. This is actually based on observations built up over the space of 3 days of kind of fluvial section, shallow marine, slope, and then basin floor. So, but again, the students making observations. I mean, we gave them a couple of hours to put all this together, and we assessed it. So in this case, that's why this is has got such care lavished on it. So I think maybe just to sort of try and summarise, some of the advantages and disadvantages that we found in our experience. Well, the advantages are we didn't have to worry about the weather. We recorded what we did as we went along, and so that meant that the students were able to access those recordings, and that I think that helped quite a few of them to sort of keep up with the general level of the group. We had some backup exercises, some of which we used, some of which we didn't, but we weren't sure quite how it was going to work at the beginning, so we planned for a little bit of redundancy. These high resolution photo panoramas were pretty effective. And again, I think we used a pretty low tech version of these. If you were using gigapans, for example, for some outcrops, that would allow you to really play on that a lot more, I think. We didn't have any field incidents. I think every year we've been to Spain, we've had at least 2 or 3 students who've ended up having to go to health centres and dentists. So it was nice that we weren't having to deal with that in a second language. And there's also scope to allow other lecturers to join in. So we had a Richard Jolly from BP and Mike Mayle, ex-BP, joined us for a day when we were looking at the Ainsa turbidites, for example, and they were able to pass on their own experience of working on similar projects in the subsurface. So I think the disadvantages, well, nothing really measures up to observing the rocks up close. And I think probably for me the main disadvantage of that is that we were quite guided in what we gave the students to work on. What they didn't really get is that aspect of critically deciding where I'm going to make my observations. We told them, or we gave them the observations to begin with. There was certainly more preparation time for us, I think probably also on the students, and part of that was building in redundancy, but we felt we needed to have that just in case things didn't go as we planned. We used the PhD demonstrators, the GTAs, probably far more intensively than we would have done if we were physically in Spain, but also probably more than we originally envisaged as well. So we needed more of them than we would have done had we been in Spain, and they worked for longer hours. Fortunately, they were in a position where they could do that. I think I would probably add another 50% to that kind of GTA staffing level if I, for any future field trips compared to being physically in the field. I mean, one sort of key issue was students having different work environments, and that was most directly obvious in terms of different levels of internet connection and bandwidth. Some students having tablets, laptops they could use, some students not having those. There's also a bunch of other underlying pastoral issues, some students having care and responsibilities and so on. So, I mean, we were fortunate in the sense that, because we knew these students pretty well at the beginning, they felt able to share a lot of issues with us beforehand and as they came up. And we did a little bit of kind of offline tutorials really with some of those students who were most badly affected to try and keep them up to speed. So, on top of that field day, there's probably at least another hour on top of that, just talking to individuals and trying to, or small groups of 2 or 3 students, and trying to get them up to speed. Marking assessments was a bit of a pain, to be honest, and we've also found that to some extent with online exams as well. The biggest thing was basically it's not the students doing the work, it's the students getting the work to us. So what we found, not so much for the field trip, but for exams, is that Lens or a similar piece of software that can basically take multiple pictures, build a single PDF, which is typically reasonable in size, that's the way to try to do this, and then having somewhere for students to upload their work. The actual marking itself probably took 2 or 3 times longer for us than it would have been had we physically been in Spain. So typically we'd sit down, the staff and the student demonstrators, the GTAs, in the evening. We spend 2 or 3 hours looking through an exercise together, you know, putting different student scripts into different piles, you know, A, B, C. That we weren't able to do to the same extent remotely, and that's where the time went. It was really, you know, we weren't able to get off the same amount of sort of training to the GTAs in terms of marking. That meant it took longer for them to do the marking. It also meant that for us there was a bigger element of QC than we would typically have had normally. So take home from that is, you know, think carefully about what you want to mark and how long it's going to take to do it. So I've got sort of 3 or 4 slides at the end, and you know, these aren't very sexy. They're all lots of text, but and I think this is, you know, things that I hope I've said already, but these are sort of 4 sort of take-home messages for us. So the first is, you know, managing time and expectations. So you know, try and stick close to classroom teaching hours, because obviously you're not in the field. Students probably have other things they need to be doing as well as, you know, that they wouldn't be doing if they were physically on the field trip. So, you know, be conscious of that. And you'll also probably feel pretty tired after the end of doing all of this at the end of the day too. So just do the essentials and don't expect to do more than that. Second bullet point there, you know, allow the first day for everyone to sort of get up to speed with their online connection. Make sure that give them time to check they've got everything to hand they need to have to hand. So that the first day definitely felt like it was the hardest part, and after that, you know, we all settled into routine, both the students, the GTAs, and the staff. And you know, a good kind of briefing before the field trip is probably a prerequisite as well. We also found I think, well, Lydia and I both thought rather naively, because we weren't going to be sitting on a coach for 3 hours a day traveling between outcrops, that actually we might rattle through some days really rather quickly, but that never really happened. You know, making sure there are breaks for people to go to the bathroom, have a cup of tea, just take a bit of time out and before coming back. You know, that's what maybe we hadn't really accounted for, and that would typically be done on the coach in the field. And we also found that just the mechanics of everyone working remotely also took a bit longer than everyone being physically in the same place. So I think, you know, you can expect to spend as much working time working remotely as on a field trip as actually kind of in the field itself. You know, cut out any non-essential items. I think, again, for us, maybe one of the benefits of this, and this probably applies to other online teaching now we're getting into it, is that you really have to decide. Things become much more stark. You know, what is it we want the students to learn from doing this? How do we plan to do that effectively? And everything else, just all the non-essentials just fall away essentially. There's a bit of flexibility in how you travel between locations, because you're not constrained by geographical logistics. You know, do make recordings as you go along, because you know they're things that students can refer back to, points that maybe weren't clear in the day. You know, they can review those later on. And obviously the big one here is, you know, be sympathetic to and keep track of mitigating circumstances, so you're aware of, you know, those students who are being quiet. Well, maybe there's a reason they're being quiet, and just, you know, try and keep on top of them, on top of those kind of issues. And I think that's probably relatively straightforward if you know the student group. I think I'm anticipating that, you know, running field trips for new student groups next year might be more difficult. Building those sort of personal relationships is something we'll have to work on. Okay, so the second one in here, you know, just preparation basically. Once the field trip starts, there's not much time to do things differently. So a lot of it, you just have to be really well prepared up front. And, you know, I suspect some of this, most of this is there for any field trip in terms of field guide and exercises. We did pre-record some videos to introduce particular days or locations, and they worked really well. But and I think if we had a bit more time beforehand, we would have done more of that. Certainly that's something we're planning to do for future field trips. The more videos we can pre-record, the better, basically. And then, small teaching groups was really, really effective. So I'd encourage you to think about ways of doing that. Okay, the second thing about exercises, that really comes down to, again, thinking very clearly about what you want the students to learn from this. So, and constructing things around tasks and exercises is one way the students actually actively doing things and thinking through what they're doing, and doing that in small groups was very effective. But assessment inevitably kind of raises the tensions for everyone in the student group, and they were, the ways of submitting that work kind of compounded that to some degree. So I've already said small teaching groups, and try and get the best demonstrators you can already, and pre-record things beforehand as much as you're able to, because again, that will save you time on the during the trip itself, and also gives flexibility to students in how they access material. Okay, so third one there, I mean, I've already said the working environment varies, and probably in your student groups, as in ours, there'll be a big range of what people are working with and how good their internet connection is. So, just in some ways, plan for those who are at the lower end of the spectrum in terms of what sort of technology they've got available to them. And again, these small teaching groups was quite an effective way of monitoring that. The pre-recorded videos also help with that, because that students could watch them, sometimes download them and watch them, rather than having to rely on an internet connection to watch things live. Internet bandwidth, well, some of that requires hardware. So buying a 4G USB dongle is something which is relatively cheap. Okay, that depends obviously who you're talking to, but so there are some relatively quick fixes. Another advantage of teaching in small groups is that if you've got 10 people trying to join a conversation, that takes up less bandwidth than having 40 people trying to join a conversation, for example. And do be aware that some of the really good kind of software tools, but also can also be pretty heavy in terms of computational time. So Google Earth, for example, the virtual outcrop models, and again, I think if we'd had more time, the experience we've had so far, those would be the kind of things where it'd be really useful to have video recordings that you've made already, and you can share those with those students who aren't able to do things kind of on the fly in real time. Advise students to download as much as possible beforehand, but obviously that means you have to be prepared and ready with that material, quite some time in advance. And try and organize things as much as possible so it's easy for you and also for the students to find what they need. And I think the last of the engaging with the students, and I alluded to this earlier, that if we were there in person on the field trip, then it's kind of easier to spot those students who maybe are having difficulty with understanding things. You can see their faces, and you can maybe see when you're explaining things in the right way or clearly. So again, pre-recorded videos helps with that. Having small groups, students are obviously find it easier to bring things up in smaller groups, to share things, or ask questions of GTAs rather than staff. We found that chat messages were really useful. I'm sure everyone's found this already, but that was the best way of handling questions in Q&A sessions. Although that does require having someone who basically monitors the chat in a dedicated way, as Catherine is doing for this. So you need basically 2 people at least, one talking, one monitoring if you're using that. Sharing screens was useful, and actually students, probably after the first day when everyone was feeling their way through it a little bit, the students were actually very happy to take photographs of work on paper and share those with the group on screen, or post them into images into chats, for example. that was the best way we found of you know, close to real-time sharing of students' work with the group. We had to do a little bit of ad hoc offline teaching to those students who were really affected by, you know, kind of limited hardware or other issues as well. But it's still, we still find it difficult to draw in some of the quieter members of the class. And the other thing students' feedback was largely positive at the end of the field trip. I mean, I think that they realised that we were teaching this under sort of circumstances that were new for us as well as for them, and they appreciated the fact that we were obviously putting in a lot of effort. They could tell that we were putting a lot of effort, and we were kind of being responsive to what they wanted as well. I guess, you know, the work we assessed, you know, the grade distribution was very similar to previous years. So based on that, it looks as though by and large the learning outcomes are met. So, you know, we feel it was a pretty positive experience. We were able to offer something that was useful to the students. And I think, you know, the last thing on there is, you know, this is the class of 2019-20. They didn't actually make it out to Spain, but there they all are. Mugshot photographs from the beginning of this academic year, stuck against the backdrop on there. And I think my last slide now is really just a list of resources. And I mean, I'm sure, you know, you've probably already seen with various forums even, people sharing lots of material, which is great. The first two on there are webinars I discovered after we'd run the field trip, but were actually kind of really useful, maybe in the more general way of thinking about what you want students to learn from the field trip and how you'll set it up. So the UFERN and IAGD webinars are both really useful in that respect, and they're both about an hour long and recorded. The next three are resources for sort of fairly simple, you know, first, second year level fieldwork skills. So those weren't things that we used directly on our field trip, but we know those are resources that some of my colleagues at Imperial who are teaching first and second year classes are using. And then we've got a group of resources, including the virtual outcrop models, and sort of more computationally intensive tools. So I'd say, you know, those can be really useful, but they obviously need a bit of prep time for you if you're planning to use them to get things in the right format. And, you know, the last one in there, you know, if you want to find out a bit more about how we actually did this in practice, we have kind of put together a compilation material from one of our teaching days on the Shallow Marine Rhoda sandstone. So that's jointly using material with Allard Martinius, who's based at Delft University. So that's there online if you want to access that. I mean, that gives you maybe an idea about what we actually did and how it worked in practice, but we think that's also kind of a standalone day's worth of teaching resource that it might be useful for some people in that respect as well. Okay, I think that's it. So hopefully I didn't speak too fast, and hopefully you were able to follow the screen okay. I think time for questions now, Catherine, is that right?
Thank you so much, Gary. It's really exciting to see that these things can be pulled off, because they've sort of felt a little bit like a fairy tale. It's sort of like this thing that we need to now aspire to in the future, and it's really exciting to see how positively this has gone, and take the learnings for a new generation of field trips. So thank you very much for that. We've got the questions coming into the chat now. Whilst you're typing your questions, I'm just going to comment that, and if you do think of anything later, and any questions later, or if you are watching the recording and come up with a question, then Gary has kindly agreed to answer questions in the forums on the Seds Online page, and there will be a dedicated thread up there soon. So let's start with the questions that have come through here. We have a question for you, Gary, asking if you could explain what a GTA is.
So a GTA is a graduate teaching assistant. So that's the jargon that Imperial College uses for a PhD student who's demonstrating for that class. So effectively a PhD student demonstrator.
Great, thank you. We have another question from Mikkel saying, thanks for this very interesting presentation, Gary. I was wondering which parts would you advise to have as pre-recorded material?
So I think certainly sort of the briefings at the beginning of each day. So that would typically be half an hour where you're explaining, what the aims of the day are, where we're going to visit on that day, and what we want to get from each location. And I suppose the reason I say that is that's typically kind of the longest bit of talking that you might do in a day, typically in the field, and it's obviously pretty critical in terms of setting up what you then do for the rest of the day. So you want to make sure that everyone understands that and that it is kind of on top of that. So by pre-recording it, and then releasing that, before the day itself, it means that everyone has a chance to access that. They can listen to it more than once if they need to. If they've got any questions, they're coming, if you like, they're coming to the field with those questions. And it also means that any delays around internet connection, for example, that you avoid those or you minimize those. Also, I'd say also exercise solutions were also useful too, for similar kind of reasons that if for whatever reason that the connection isn't so great, you end up having to repeat things, or the things become a bit disjointed in the screening, that you can lose lots of the students and you end up having to repeat yourself a lot. But if those are pre-recorded, again, the students can look at them whenever they want. They can look at them multiple times, and then they can ask questions based on that if anything's not clear.
That's great. We have a question then from Benjamin, asking, what's a good software or app or tool to use for measuring the attitude of the structure from photographs?
Okay, so I think you're now kind of moving into so yeah, the slide. I think I'm sure. Am I still sharing my screen? Yeah. So I think this. I think if you were looking for a software tool, then probably the virtual reality geological studios. That's the third bullet point up from the bottom. That's a good piece of software for doing that, but it does depend on having a virtual outcrop model of a particular outcrop of a particular quality to use. So I think that's the ideal. If you have the right material and enough time to sort of prepare things, that would be the gold standard, if you'd like. I think if you're not in that position, and that was true for most of our outcrops, then we annotated photographs, for example. Also through things like paid occurrence, effectively we gave the students that material. So that again is probably something that works okay for students who have those basic field skills, and you're looking for them to use those in an applied sense, but it's much harder to do that for those students who are trying to learn those basic field skills, I think.
Okay. We have a question from Kathy, who says, thank you very much for sharing your experience. It's very helpful. Based on your experience, what are your thoughts on how you would teach basic field skills to the lower level students?
Okay, so that's a great question, and I think well, probably the best answer I can give to that is I have a couple of my colleagues, Matthew Genge and Mark Sutton, who've just taken a similar virtual field trip to Sardinia for first year students, and they're both far more technologically adept than I am, and they have put together some kind of virtual reality type things, so students going into the location, setting up in a way they can measure dip and strike. I think you probably need something like that particularly for structural measurements and directional measurements. I think it's very difficult to do that in any other kind of way. I think for things like sedimentary structures, I think just having good photographs is probably the way to go, particularly if you can support those with line drawings or videos that show how those structures form. I mean, that does then start to, you're then talking more about a typical lecture class but delivered online rather than a field class. But I think that's probably how I'd approach that. Again, the difficulty is basically you have to kind of guide the students with the observations they make. You're not in a position where they can make their own observations unless you really do have a virtual outcrop or something they can explore.
Yeah, it's one I think we'll need to keep thinking about, isn't it?
Yeah,
so,
yeah.
yeah. But thank you for that. So we've got two questions from Yako. First question was, what was the feedback from the students? And his second question is asking if you see a future of virtual field courses beyond this crisis.
Okay, so the feedback from the students. So at the end of the field course, they were very positive. You know, I think they felt they had learned, you know, what we were aiming to teach them, or aiming for them to learn in the field course. What I would also say is at the beginning it was pretty fraught. So partly it's because this was only, you know, kind of 2 weeks or maybe even less than that into lockdown. Everyone was very uncertain about all kinds of things, and the level of angst for everyone was pretty high. So actually at the end of the first field day, I had half the students basically email me individually and say, I'm really struggling with X, Y, and Z. And I did go to bed that night and think, what on earth are we doing? How is this going to work out? But actually, again, it kind of once we got into it, you know, once the students, I think, felt comfortable with the routine of just learning online and how that was working, how they could interact with us and with each other, those issues, that sort of level of angst just tends to dissipate. I suspect actually that now, because, you know, we're all teaching remotely to different groups of students, that level of angst will probably be quite a lot less. They'll be used to aspects of that remote working piece, but it's still something to watch for, I would say. In terms of kind of future, I mean, I'm sure there is a future for virtual field trips. Some of the obvious ones are, you know, for either places which are not easy to get to, or for students who are not able to get to those places. And that, you know, it's obviously in terms of access, you know, there's a real potential there to build on these. That, you know, doing that well probably does mean putting in an awful lot of time and using virtual outcrop models and more sophisticated tools to prepare something really, really good for that. I mean, but I think there are some much simpler things. So, for example, you know, I think probably the briefing we give the students before we go on the next kind of outdoors field trip will probably be quite different to what we've done in the past. Rather than just half an hour of basic logistics and, you know, be at the airport by 8 o'clock, or else, you know, you have to pay for your next flight. You know, we'll actually spend a bit more time maybe using things like Google Earth, virtual material to set that up and provide the context before we actually go out in the field. There's maybe scope to intersperse that a bit more with, you know, say an hour in the evening and each field as well, depending on, you know, time and structure of field trips too.
That kind of answers Eva's question as well. And Eva also asks about any resources that you know of for virtual carbonate field trips. Do you know of any?
I mean, I know I know that some of the virtual outcrop models, so that's John and Simon's and also Adams and Claire, that they do have virtual outcrops of specific carbonate outcrops in there. I suspect there's probably also a lot in these other resources towards the top, particularly the SERC Carleton College Teach the Earth site. There's absolutely loads of material on there, and, you know, I've in looking through that, I've only really kind of scratched the surface of what I've looked at.
Great. Amy, I hope you feel like we've answered your question, which is scope of using virtual field courses as alternative assessments. Is there anything you want to comment on that, Gary, with using virtual field courses as alternative assessments for improving accessibility in the future?
Yes, so well, I guess in terms of improving accessibility, then it definitely the scope to develop them further. And I think, but it probably would need developing further than what we've done here. If you like, this is kind of a sticking plaster in that sort of context, what I've presented here. I think in terms of assessment, though, I think I'd find it pretty difficult to. I wouldn't feel very comfortable, for example, taking in a virtual field notebook and marking that. But if you can structure exercises, which are essentially classroom exercises, but you're supporting them with field observations, I think that, which is what we did, I think that can work pretty well.
Great. We've got one more question, and then we've got a couple of notices from Seds Online. But before we get to that, we have a question from Amanda. asking which applications did the students struggle with the most to interact and use in terms of the bandwidth of their computing power?
It was basically all the computationally intensive ones. So, you know, we had a few students who were accessing either from outside the UK or from households where there were, you know, 7 or 8 people trying to access the internet at the same time. And Google Earth was one that struggled with that. And also the virtual outcrop models themselves. So I think we didn't really have enough time to sort of pre-record videos of those, but you know, for doing this in the future, I'd try and make sure that I'd pre-recorded videos of those and then distributed them earlier so that students could access them without necessarily doing it live in real time via limited bandwidth.
Thank you very much again, Gary, for your time and for giving us this presentation. We're really pleased to be able to host these kinds of events where we feel like we're creating resources for people to come back and reference in the future. So you're very much paving the way. So thank you very much. And yeah, quite a few people are saying thank you on the chat as well. So that's
well, thanks for having me.
Not a problem. Just before everyone signs off, we have a couple of notices from Seds Online. First one is that we've got our quiz celebrating 1,000 members on Friday, even though we are more than that, but it may or may not be one of the questions, but it's of how many members that we have, so I'm not telling you any more details. So we have a lot of things planned in the future, so do go and have a look at our events page. It's starting to fill up and get quite exciting, so be sure to go have a look. And also, anybody who wasn't able to make it to the Carbonate Forum, go and check out our meeting library, because we've managed to record and make live, make available most of the events up on there too. So I think that those are the main notices. And everybody is saying thank you very much to you, Gary.
Thanks.
With that, I think we'll call it. So thank you very much for coming along, everyone.